All right, folks, this is going to be part two of how to grow a poem. This part, I think, is a little bit more advanced. So if you haven't watched part one, you might want to start there. Part two is of how to grow a poem is going to focus on a way to basically generate a poem without basically just kind of staring at a blank page and then figuring out, waiting for inspiration to strike and seeing, what happens. This is going to help you, I think, get through a whole draft of a poem and maybe even a finished one. So I call this variations on a theme. It's a way to grow a poem or to write a poem. And we've covered this before, I think, in another video with aphorisms. If you don't remember what an aphorism is, it's a usually short, sometimes funny saying that expresses the truth. And an example of one is actions speak louder than words. I usually like to start with a list anytime I go to write. So much can come from that list, and sometimes the list itself can become a poem. So go ahead and in step one, you're going to list like 5 different aphorisms. You usually take a few minutes to do that, but I'm going to let you pause the video if you're doing it now, and just give yourself enough time to list at least 5. In the second step, you're going to choose a favorite from the first step. So looking back at your list, I want you to ask yourself, like, which one is my favorite, or which one is sort of speaking to me today. And today, the one that's speaking to me is actions speak louder than words. All right, so that's going to be my aphorism. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start translating that idea, which is spoken in very sort of common language. I'm going to translate it into images and words that are less common, but sticking with the same idea. And there's really no wrong way to do this. If you really want to if that idea, actions speak louder than words, makes you think of, say, like the opposite idea, go ahead, but the goal is to not sort of start from scratch and coming up with every piece of the poem on your own, but using something that pre-exists in order to generate new language. So I always, I think 5 is sort of a magic number for me. So you can see here, I've come up with, 5 different translations of the idea actions speak louder than words. My love shines brighter than diamonds. Freedom flaps its wings harder than eagles. Clowns crow longer than corn. The game of grief is played with extra innings. The balloon of enthusiasm soon discovers that it's made of lead. Obviously, not all of these are great lines of poetry, but usually at least one of them is, or at least makes me think, I think I can kind of work with this. And for today, that one is going to be the game of grief is played with extra innings, which is 100% something that I generated just by kind of translating and retranslating that original aphorism. So that's what we do. We decide on a favorite line from step 2, right? You're kind of seeing a trend here. And this line is really important, this step, because it's going to serve a kind of dual purpose. It's going to kind of work double duty. I'm going to call it both a magnet and a refrain. And I'm going to explain what those 2 things are. But just to reiterate, the line that we're talking about here is the game of grief is played with extra innings. Now we're going to start growing the poem. We kind of basically have the first line or a line in the poem, and we're going to grow it basically line by line. And what's great about writing a poem line by line, which, by the way, that's what really all a poem is a story or a text or chunk of language that's divided into lines, is that, like, if you write them line by line and each line kind of works on its own in some way, later it makes the revision phase much easier because you can just rearrange them and see what order makes the most sense. In part one, I already went over sensory detail and story, so I'm not going to go over it now. But the thing to add, the new way to grow the poem is with something I like to call reverberating sound. Or resonating sound. And it's something that is like a huge part of poetry. And you probably have already encountered some of these terms before in your class, like, rhyme, we all tend to know, as well as alliteration, but also anagram, chiasmus, anaphora, parallelism, and really any of these techniques that basically focus on the pieces of words that make up the sound. Like alliteration is repeating the initial consonant sound of a word. All right, so using these methods, including the sensory detail and the story method, I'm going back to the poem and sort of asking it to say more about what it's already said. So that's how we're growing the poem. The game of grief is played with extra innings. Ice caps may melt, hair may be thinning, still players toss the ball around and tie the score. Why do we insist so much on someone winning? Bone-tired workers drop more corn dogs into fryers. More beer is sold for dozens and dozens of dollars. All seats, aluminum or plush, bench or cushion, uncomfortable. When will some umpire intervene? What for? Third base is stolen. There's hope he'll cross home plate. But isn't it hope that's kept us here so late? So all I did in order to get that portion of the poem was to ask some of those questions. Like, I asked the question, how does it feel, to be at this game of grief? What are you sitting on? Also sort of, what does it smell or what does it taste like? That's how I got the corn dogs and the beer, and also who else is involved. The umpire is somebody who is usually a part of every baseball game with the innings. And also just that, a little quick note about that reverberating sound. Innings got me to thinning, and it also got me winning. So it's starting to make the poem kind of come together and kind of cohere around some repeated sounds. So that's basically using that line, that first line, as a kind of magnet. And another way to grow the poem is using it as that line as a refrain. In other words, actually just to repeat that line at certain places when you feel stuck. And it's really great to have some technique set out for yourself at the beginning for a way to get unstuck, because that's one of the most common ways that writing a poem will kind of grind to a halt, is that you get stuck and you just don't know what else to do. My suggestion, especially when you're writing the poem line by line, is to use one line as a refrain. Just stick it back in and let it repeat itself and see what else can emerge. When I did that, you'll remember I ended there with, but could it be hope that's kept us here so late? The game of grief is played with extra innings, and we thought 9 was all we'd have to manage. Who promised us, if not the championship, the pennant? So that's basically all I did. Is I just stuck that line back in there and let it sort of continue. I started asking some of those same story-based and sensory detail-based questions, and allowed myself to be guided by the sound of it. And then the last part, I hinted at this earlier in the first step, that the last step of any writing exercise or poem exercise is revision. And as I said, this particular assignment is really easy to revise because all the lines are basically on their own. So I made a few changes here and there, but this is what I came up with just by using this method. The game of grief is played with extra innings, and we thought 9 was all we'd have to manage. Who promised us, if not the championship, the pennant? Ice caps may melt, hair may be thinning, still players toss the ball around and tie the score. When will some umpire intervene? What for? The game of grief is played with extra innings. Bone-tired workers drop more corn dogs into fryers. More beer is sold for dozens and dozens of dollars. Why do we insist so hard on someone winning? All seats, aluminum or plush, bench or cushion, mount what feels like a rebellion. Our feet fail us. The game of grief is played with extra innings. Third base is stolen. There's hope he'll cross home plate. But isn't it hope, I hear, that keeps us up so late? So there's plenty more work to be done, but I'm going to end there and just encourage you to write a poem line by line and rearrange it. And if you ever get stuck, use one of the lines as a refrain.